We're here to learn about blueberries from the mighty Christof Bernau, who has been involved with the Center for Agroecology since coming to Santa Cruz as an apprentice in 1994 and has been a staff member since 1999. Christof has extensive experience in nursery management, propagation, vegetables, and specialty cut flower production. He is especially interested in nutritionally dense crops, small-scale grain production, creating a learning, growing environment where everybody can thrive, and the cultivation of small fruits. Take it away, Christof.
Thank you, Jana. And thank you everyone for being here. And thank you everybody who's out there in the ethers somewhere in a nice, warm, cozy place, hopefully. Hopefully you have not all been impacted too heavily by our recent weather events. I have some friends whose house is under about 3 feet of mud down in Larkin Valley right now. Probably be going there after this to pitch in a little, or pitch out as it were. Yeah, just a quick note on the spring plant sale. Many of you probably know that we have done it for many years down at the base of the campus. That zone has gotten really busy with bus traffic and dust. There won't be any dust today, but anyway, we decided to move up into this location because one, it's a really beautiful space. Two, if we bring the plants in well watered, they're not getting all the wind and so forth, so we don't necessarily have to keep watering through the weekend. And then the plants can also sit here sort of safely overnight between the Saturday and Sundays and so forth. So yeah, tons and tons of annual seedlings. I think we have somewhere in the order of 450 different cultivars and varieties coming, and somewhere in the order of about 120 different species and or types of vegetables, cut flowers, and annual herbs. So yeah, I will, one caveat, the weather has made things grow rather slowly so far, so I'm a little worried about how big all these plants will be when you're trying to get all those things to be mature seedlings at the same time, but we're moving in the right direction, I think. Yeah, well, I wanted to start, Jessica, is that the second or first slide? Okay, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to start kind of just with this cover slide with a, oh, and actually I should also say, I think most of you know this or probably, but we're going to spend about 2 hours in here, then we'll take a break. And then for the folks who are here in person, and hopefully it won't be raining too much, it's misty, we'll be just fine, but we're going to walk just up the hill, about 4 minutes up the hill to where our plot of blueberries is. It's only about 1/10 of an acre, but there's a lot of big and thriving plants there for the most part, and a few struggling ones too. And so some of what we're going to talk about here, we'll look at more three-dimensionally there, and especially get into process of pruning in a little bit more three-dimensional depth than is possible to do online. Although for folks in the virtual audience, I do have some material that I pulled off the plants this morning that I'll try best as possible to show here on this camera as well. That's repeated in some of what the slides are, but so that everybody will see kind of the some plants in the flesh as well. So in terms of what we're going to try to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about blueberry history and background, where they come from, where they grow naturally, who are some of their relatives. We are going to talk just briefly, although I have a number of slides on this, but about like where blueberries are produced and shipped and marketed all over the place, because blueberries are now a crop that one can pretty much get 365 days a year in most stores. And when I was a kid and growing up, it was very much a seasonal thing, as were many things. But anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about where blueberries are being produced for larger scale commercial distribution at this point. And then we're going to get into things around life cycle, seasonal care, how we think about if you're starting from scratch, wanting to plant blueberries, a little bit about different ways to think about amending and improving your soil to create the acidic environment that blueberries really want and need. We'll talk about kind of seasonal maintenance and the types of steps that we think are important for ongoing care for your plants to prosper. And within that will certainly be some things around pruning as well. And a little bit on pests and diseases too, though thankfully blueberries are, at least in our experience, have relatively limited pest and disease issues. So, but we will go into that a little bit, and then just also talk about some resources if you are having issues of where you may track down more information. So, yeah, and then the other thing I would say is, so that's the general trajectory, but if I'm saying anything that doesn't make sense, needs clarification, further elaboration, please don't hesitate to ask. And if it's something that I know I'm going to get to later, I'll sort of push it in that direction. But otherwise, yeah, I want to make sure as we're going through things make sense and are going to help you grow your own blueberries and then harvest and enjoy them. So, okay, maybe Jessica, next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of, actually had a really interesting, this entire slideshow I redid some things and the whole thing got reformatted, and I thought I corrected everything. I don't know, that's what this is supposed to say is low bush blueberries are Vaccinium angustifolium, and rabbit-eye blueberries are Vaccinium ashii, but I don't know why it's doing that. The whole thing, like something really weird. There you go. Thank you. That might help. Whole thing got yesterday. I was like, what happened? As I was changing some of the slides, but much better. So I just want to start off by saying, so blueberries have been an important food staple in the Americas for literally thousands and thousands of years. The native people in the native range of blueberries literally harvesting, tending, caring for blueberries for many thousands of years. And maybe actually, will you jump to the next slide and we'll get into a little bit of the range of things. So this is actually a USDA map. I will say that this is not blueberries. That is, I think it's actually just downright wrong. But Jessica, is it possible to get rid of this thing? Okay, sorry. So the what we call the low bush blueberry, if you ever have bought quote unquote wild blueberries in the store or at a farmer's market, those are likely semi-cultivated, essentially tended wild plantings that are really going to be way up.
I don't know.
Okay, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I love technology. They're plants that are really going to be growing basically from kind of northern tier states into Canada is really their principal range for the low bush blueberry. And to a lesser extent down here, but much more commonly here, and certainly in what is now sort of cultivated wild blueberries, really coming from farther north. Vaccinium corymbosum, which is the high bush blueberry, has a much, much wider native range, really running all the way down across the South Atlantic states and into northern Florida. This map kind of generalizes whole states, even when things don't necessarily grow there. But what is, I think, important to take into note from this is, so if you think about, first of all, the people who have lived here pre-Columbus, pre-contact, there's an immense population across all of this territory, all of this land. And so clearly this could be a really valuable food source with some level of annual tending and care. And for us as contemporary farmers, gardeners, the points of origins of these plants, there's quite a range of ecological conditions, climate conditions across these places. And we, here in California, Central California, our conditions are really quite different. I just saw that. I'll try to face the camera. I guess I can look at my screen here and point at it. But when we're here on the Central Coast, one of the things that we're really having to think about, and I'm going to get into this in a little bit, but it's like how much winter cold, or what's sometimes referred to as chill hours, do we have? And can we select varieties that are more or less in alignment with our winter chill hours? So most of the high bush blueberries that are in cultivation either their points of origin in terms of breeding, really much of them come from Florida and the South Atlantic states, and then all the way up into New England. But that, again, provides this immense climate range, which we'll get into how that's useful. There's a vast array for where blueberries come from. And let's go to the next slide for a sec. So on the West Coast, blueberries, the Vaccinium corymbosum and angustifolium and the other species, they don't actually grow here. What we principally have is the Vaccinium ovatum, which you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. And those plants grow typically in a mixed coniferous, sometimes mixed hardwood, but more open canopied forest up and down both the Coast Range and to a certain extent Sierra foothills as well, but all the way up into Canada. And for people in this area, for the Amamutsu right here, the Vaccinium ovatum essentially would be the corollary to the high bush or low bush blueberries for native people in the East Coast, and really across the Atlantic seaboard and all the way as far west as Michigan. Here, you probably some of you have eaten huckleberries, harvested. Have any of you all eaten and harvested huckleberries before in the woods? Yeah. What do you think in terms of flavor?
Good, little acid, but
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I mean, I personally think they're really, really delicious. But if you compare them both to the like Vaccinium corymbosum, the high bush blueberry, our wild huckleberries just don't produce nearly as much fruit as the blueberries do, even the wild versions of blueberries do. And so I'm not quite sure, but maybe because of that little bit more reticent to be so extensively fruitful, there's never been an extensive breeding and development of huckleberries as a commercial crop, whether that's organic or conventional. I think they're a tremendous crop. In some places, like I know a small producer in Montana who wildcrafts the thin leaf huckleberry and then makes jam and sells that as part of their market operation and so forth. And they're super delicious, but they're just not as widespread. Does anybody know any other important food crops that are in this same family? This is the Ericaceae family, or it's sometimes called the heather or heath family. Do any of y'all know who else might be kind of in this same neighborhood? Cranberries, yeah. So actually, can we go to the next slide, Jessica? This is a slightly different image, but cranberries, by and large, are really a northern tier range. And like 20 plus years ago, I lived in New Hampshire, and we had a volunteer who would come to the farm that I worked at, and he took me so there, as this map sort of suggests, there's lots and lots of wild bogs, small little ponds and wetland type areas in openings in the forest. And he took me at one point to a wild cranberry bog that I was just completely blown away because, I'd only obviously seen them like in the store or seen like pictures of like these mass, almost the way paddy rice is grown in Northern California, where you have these kind of vast ponds that are then partly drained to harvest the berries and so forth. Really quite fascinating process. But to see them growing in the wild was really, for me, it was a really special treat. It's sort of like if any of you are mushroom foragers or no mushroom foragers, people don't typically want to share their location. So I felt like I was I was very lucky at that instance. And probably would be venturing back there regularly if I still lived in New Hampshire. But anyway, so yeah, much like the blueberry, the cranberries have become a really important commercial crop, though for reasons that I don't entirely understand, because I think they are quite delicious, and they're regularly They're regularly processed, either canned or frozen. I'm surprised that we don't eat them on kind of a wider time frame besides just in late November. But to me, they're a really important crop. And really across the board, all of these are important crops. And we're important crops for Native people and still today for a number of reasons. Super delicious. Maybe the cranberries are a little tart. You got to sweeten them up. But the other one's super delicious, wide range of nutrients, and in particular, rich in antioxidants. And, you know, and all of the benefits that you get in terms of potentially ridding your systems of toxins and so forth. With that, they can be harvested fresh, they can be preserved and made into jams. Contemporarily, we might just freeze them, but then also they really dry quite readily. And as a dried crop for people for thousands of years, it seems like blueberries are less commonly dried now, but as a dried crop, then you have all of the same nutritional and flavor profile, but that's something that doesn't require any sophisticated storage. And can be eaten throughout long and cold winters. So, yeah, to my mind, they're a super valuable crop. Let's move to the next slide. So just to give you a sense of where blueberries are grown commercially, the high bush blueberries are grown pretty widely and are produced. If you look at this map, you'll see Oregon, Washington are significant producers, but this is really, in the top map is really where highest concentration are produced, and then this wider map that encompasses quite a few more states are all other states where there's significant commercial production. This map at this point is about 7 years old, so I imagine statistics have changed somewhat, but really, now here in California, we have much more production than we ever did before, and we can move on to the next slide. If you take a look at this, you'll see, and this is at this point is almost 10 years old, and I actually wasn't able to track down anything more current than this in terms of statistics across all of these states, but if you look at this, you'll see that California in 1994 was producing had about 5,000 acres of commercially harvested blueberries. That has changed substantially, though, and now there's somewhere closer to 15,000 acres in total in California now. But one thing to take note, if you compare across these, yield per acre in California is really high compared to much of the other producer states. What do y'all think? Why? I mean, California is a really productive place for agriculture across the board, but what do you think are some reasons why blueberries specifically, that definitely were way out of their native range, why do we do so well with blueberries here? Yeah, generally one extended harvest, but really long growing season and much longer picking period is the main thing. Is that where you're going to say something along those lines, or? And yeah, and then there's certainly a huge market demand for them here as well. But yeah, I think fundamentally we have enough, and like I said, I'll circle back to winter chill in a minute, but we have enough winter chill that dormancy and then are triggered into abundant flowering when they break out of dormancy. And then an extended, long, quite favorable growing season, assuming you have adequate water to meet the plant's needs. And that then translates into really high yields. And, you know, clearly fertility and pest and disease management are also part of that picture. But yeah, here in California, we do quite well. Jessica, next slide, please. This is a little bit more of the same, slightly more current. This is up to 2019 with now in this one, in 2019, California had almost 7,300 acres. And still, well, just below Oregon, which has got, in terms of yield, is Oregon similarly, though, really long, favorable growing climate. And that would basically be true of Washington too. Those states, even though you may have a little bit shorter actual growing season, being further north, you get longer days further north, and that translates into some of that same nice long growing season without the same kind of frost parameters that you might have in the Northeast or Michigan or somewhere else that's fairly far north too. Next slide. Just to give you a little sense of who else produces a lot of blueberries. Up in British Columbia, similarly, pretty extensive blueberry cultivation there. And then Mexico, much of the fruit that comes to us in the early season is coming out of Mexico. At this time of year, if you go to the next slide, you'll see really that South America with Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, not much comes to California from New Zealand, but a lot is exported out of New Zealand elsewhere. But with their 6 months reversed growing season, that, and then some real similar kind of climate conditions that are matched with the needs of the blueberries, this translates into the ability for in supermarkets and New Leaf and places like that we actually see blueberries pretty much year round. I personally, I think I said something to this effect right at the very beginning, but I kind of really treasure blueberries as a seasonal thing. And my dad actually, he'll come and visit, and he always brings blueberries with him like year round because he loves blueberries. I'm like, oh, I don't even want to eat those, Dad. I was just, they're just not as good. I mean, they're good, but they're just not quite the same. So, but I think I have somehow perhaps growing these plants here and the abundance that they produce, I've really focused my own personal, like, oh, this is totally a seasonal thing. We've got like 2.5, 3 months of harvest. And then the rest of the year, I don't think I want to eat blueberries unless they're like frozen or dried or jam. But that probably not everybody feels that way, but that's what has happened to me over time. Jessica, next slide, please. So I want to kind of get into a little bit of like growth stages and where we're at. And I'm going to pass around some material in a moment here for folks who are in person here. But if you look at this slide on the left is basically 4 stages of bud development. And then on the right is 3 stages of leaf development or leaf bud, and then leaves just emerging. And kind of take a look. I'm going to pass these around, but then I want to circle back to these as well for folks who are here. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll show it. I'll show you all. I don't know to what extent you're going to be able to see this. I'm going to come back to this single stem because it has some relevance in terms of life cycle in just a moment. But the things that folks here will see is you've got these kind of slender, pointy buds, narrower down. I don't know if you can actually see that. And then really quite plump, round buds that are swelling. They're probably in this, if you look at the slide, these buds are basically in the bud break, somewhere between bud swell and bud break stage of development. But this is just a single 1-year branch that grew last year. And then, again, really hard to see this online. This one here, we're similarly in that kind of bud swell, bud break, but we've got lateral branches that have formed. And this is just a 2-year-old branch. And then lower down on those, you've got these kind of more slender, pointy buds. So I'm going to pass these so you all can get a closer look at them. And if you can circle them back my way eventually. This is important, being able to recognize the difference between leaf bud and flower buds is really important. One, for you to be able to get some sense of, okay, what's happening? Where are my plants at? How much fruit do I think I'm going to get this coming season? But then also that can really be informative in terms of your pruning processes. And how much am I actually going to prune out? How much do I want to leave behind? And we'll get into this when we go up into the plants a little bit more. But when we talk more about pruning too, I'll say this again, but with pruning, we are actually sacrificing quite a lot of fruit. We are cutting and removing branches that will produce fruit. And that's, in certain ways, that's a little bit different than how you might think about pruning apples, plums, peaches, things like that. We're always trying to grow more and more fruit-bearing wood, but we do most of our work to reduce any excessive fruit load with those trees. We do most of our work to reduce excessive fruit loads simply by thinning the just developing young fruit. Blueberries produce so many flowers and so many flowers in clusters and so many fruit buds that it would be really, really impractical to come through after the fact, after the fruit is already set, and try to do any sort of thinning to reduce the fruit load. So we generally think about managing the fruit load or reducing it so that the plants can also grow strong vegetatively. We generally think of that as really being part of the actual pruning process. And I'm sort of deliberately, and although always reluctantly, sacrificing portions of the plants. So if you all take a look at this, you'll see there's kind of some much older woody bark here. It gets it's kind of a little papery, peeling away, kind of cinnamony color. And then as we work our way up the stem, we get up into the younger growth, and where the fruit buds exist. This plant is further along than those first two branches that I passed out. But we've got both buds that are breaking as well as a bunch of fruit about to set on this. Mostly bud break and flowers happening though. This is a branch that I just pruned out of one of the plants up here. And I probably have, if I left this behind, I probably have a couple baskets of fruit, a couple half pints of fruit that are now not going to happen because I pruned this. But that was a very deliberate and intentional choice because the life cycle of the blueberry plants is such that over time, the individual stems or canes start to fade in vigor. And can I have those ones that went around back? Where'd they go? Thanks. So let me I'm going to come back to this in a second. So while blueberries are really long-lived plants and can be productive for 50, 60, even more years, any one part of the plant has a more finite life cycle. And so the typical pattern for blueberries is that they'll issue at somewhere in the next month or two, vegetative buds will break from the base of the plant, either from below ground or near the base of existing stems. A vegetative bud will break, and then over the course of the growing season, it will produce a fairly upright and straight, unbranched or almost unbranched stem, kind of like you see here and hopefully online that you all can see. This stem starts the whole season, is vegetative, and never produces any fruit in that first year of growth. But towards the end of the first year of growth, it sets fruit buds terminally or near terminally, near the ends of the stem, nothing further down, just near the ends of the stem. When this plant goes into year two, or when this stem or cane goes into year two of growth, what's going to happen here is that all of these fruit buds are going to open up as clusters of flowers and then hopefully be pollinated. Do y'all know who's responsible for blueberry pollination? A little side question here, I suppose. Bees, yeah. And maybe I would just say what kind of bees specifically. So certainly honeybees play an important role. But actually, and I don't know that this is universally the case, but certainly for us here and, you know, standing out in the plants while they're in bloom for hours upon hours, the principal pollinators for us are bumblebees. And that's an important thing to recognize or think about for a few different reasons. One, bumblebees tend to nest, tend to be mostly are ground nesters. And so having undisturbed habitat in and around where you may have blueberry plantings on your farm, in your garden, in your neighborhood is really valuable because that provides places for bumblebees to nest. And why we're so interested in bumblebees is they tend to fly and pollinate, gather nectar and pollen over a much wider range of environmental conditions than honeybees do. Honeybees are great, they're incredible pollinators, but they're a little bit more sensitive in terms of like on a cool, it's not that cold today, but cool-ish, misty day, even partly rainy day, the honeybees are staying home, they're hunkered down in their hives and they're happily warm inside. But the bumblebees come out over a much wider range of temperatures. And even when it's a little bit misty, if there's good forage for them, the bumblebees will be out. And they also tend to start flying earlier in the day and go till later in the day. So that's really valuable in terms of thinking about pollination. The other thing related to this is that you probably can see it here reasonably well. So these flowers, the blueberries have basically these urn-shaped flowers. And actually, if you go to the next slide for a sec, we should see this. You basically have these urn-shaped flowers. And again, here's the progression from kind of just opening flower buds all the way to petal fall when the pollination hopefully has happened and fruit set is beginning. But like if we look at the full bloom picture there or in this plant here, those urn-shaped flowers, they're actually somewhat inaccessible, especially, you know, honeybees have strong mouth parts, but not quite as strong as the bumblebees do. And it's sometimes accessing the pollen and the nectar can be challenging, but the bumblebees in particular, they do something referred to as buzz pollination when they land on flowers. As if the pollen isn't readily accessible, they actually vibrate their whole abdomen and basically rattle the flowers. And then that causes the pollen to shake. It lands on them. They fly to the next plant, the next cluster of flowers. They rattle their abdomen again or buzz their abdomen again. And some of the pollen they've already gathered from other plants works its way into the flower. Some new pollen comes into their gathering process. And so that, in addition to sort of flying over a wider range of environmental conditions, their ability to do buzz pollination also makes them a little bit more effective pollinators for this type of plant. This is not to say, oh, we don't want, honeybees don't play an important role, but I feel like anything we can do to also promote the bumblebees is really important. But yeah, let's go back to the previous slide for a second, because I want to compare and contrast some things here. So, okay, so this stem here, which probably you all can't really see, but was just a single, more or less upright stem, mostly unbranched, terminated in a bunch of flower buds. At the end of last season, those buds are swelling and are going to start to grow. This is what I'm hoping is going to happen to this branch this year. So this year we're going to get some fruit development here, but then we're also going to have lateral buds or vegetative buds produce lateral branches like this. Here, where I've got multiple laterals, the terminal portions died out, and then each of those laterals, even this little shorty here, they terminate in these fruit buds. And so this is basically a 2-year-old cane with quite a bit more fruit potential than what was on this 1-year-old cane here. And then that process, I said they have the individual portions of the plant have a somewhat finite lifespan. This process of fruiting, branching, continuing to fruit, that will continue over a several year process to where you end up with a branch like this that is probably 5 or 6 years old. And there's a range of schools of thought of exactly how long you want to maintain an individual branch or an individual stem that is branching. But most folks would say roughly 5 or 6 years is optimal. And then after 5 or 6 years, even though I just sacrificed a whole lot of fruit right here when I pruned this off, this plant, this portion of the plant, this cane, is going to start to diminish in vigor. It's not going to produce as many new laterals and as many new fruit buds this year to give me more fruit next year, and then a little bit less the following year and a little bit less the following year. So part of the way that we think about and treat our pruning process here is that we're going to each year walk up to the plants, kind of assess each individual plant. How are you doing? How strong are you? How much new growth did you generate? In any one plant, who is kind of the biggest, oldest canes that probably have tons of fruit on them, but then I'm going to actually sacrifice to think about the future. Because by removing this out of the plant, this was maybe, well, not 20%, but this was probably, this one stem here was probably 15% or so of the total biomass of the plant. By taking this out of the picture, I make way for new shoots like this one here to develop, and hopefully several new shoots, in fact, so that it's an ongoing process. What's that, Brian?
That's a winter prune?
This is a winter pruning effect, yeah. And we'll talk a little bit about summer pruning in a minute, or in a few minutes, but yeah, some people do both summer and winter pruning, and there are some folks who are essentially growing, like down in Watsonville, there's some folks who are essentially growing blueberries kind of as the quasi-hydroponic crop. They're just in coir in pots, liquid nutrient supply and pH management throughout. And they actually do a hard summer pruning right after bloom, and then really pump the plants with nutrients to try to generate as much new growth as possible. And then they do less winter pruning. But that system, while highly effective, is also really dependent on major nutrient inputs through the growing cycle. So we take a little bit kind of maybe more conservative, slower approach. But yeah, so back to the slide, just briefly, you have the kind of slender pointy buds. Those are going to be your vegetative buds, and then eventually opening as leaf clusters, and those leaf clusters will extend out and become your laterals. And that's an ongoing process that we're always going to want to be promoting. And then the plumper fruit buds are really what we're looking for in terms of this year's fruit. Let's go to next slide briefly, and then we're just going to jump back through that one. Oh, you have a question? Yeah. Great question. So really, as early as December, as late as February, this year we pruned we were just a little bit behind schedule, and we pruned it at kind of the end of February. And there's a handful of plants that I left unpruned for today's purposes, but I would say you could start anywhere December onward. But the one thing that's nice about waiting a January, maybe into early February, is that then you can you start to get a better sense, like the fruit buds versus vegetative buds, because the fruit buds are already really swelling. They start to become really quite evident. And in fact, some of the plants, when we go up there, you'll see they're in full bloom. And so seeing them in full bloom, you tend to, when you're pulling big branches and stuff like this one out as you're pruning, you're certainly knocking off more flowers. But as long as you're sort of careful, you're actually probably helping with the thinning process by some of those flower buds that are going to get damaged by your pruning process and branch removal process. I think the fundamental thing to think about in Santa Cruz with usually fairly mild winters is we have really quite a long window when it's appropriate for winter pruning. If you're in a much, much colder climate, oftentimes people will do their pruning right as they're moving into winter, or just before things are breaking out of dormancy, and may just not want to be out in the cold in the middle of the winter. But also one of the risks of pruning, and it's less of a risk here because we don't have really significant frost damage or frost potential. But if you're in a colder climate, you prune in the middle of the winter, then you get a really sort of an unexpected warm spell that can sometimes cause the plant response to having just been pruned is let's break out, let's start growing. If warm conditions come, and then if frost comes hard after that, sometimes that new, more tender growth could be vulnerable to frost damage. Let's move to the next slide here. So this is something we won't see today, unfortunately. I wish we would, but we have to come back later for this. There's actually a tiny bit of green and a little teeny bit of rosy fruit out there of a few sort of anomalous buds and branches that bloomed early. But most of what we're at is really flowering and maybe just the beginnings of petal drop. But this is approximately the progression that you will see, where you first, post-pollination, you first have green fruit, followed by kind of green to rosy fruit, and not all the fruit, with most varieties, not all the fruit ripens completely uniformly. So like in that second picture there where it says fruit coloring, you see some fruit that's already changing color and some that's still very green. And then the same is true in that sort of 25% blue. There's quite a range. In the 75% blue, my experience has been that most of the varieties that we grow, it's rare that you have totally blue clusters. You at least have some variation there. But once the fruit has fully set and developed and been harvested, then typically you start to get fruit bud development. The vegetative growth is already present, starts to grow fruit buds for the next year. And really important thing to note, and I think you can see it in these two branches here, and certainly in this bigger branch here, basically all of the flowers are out towards the outer portions of the canopy. Even if there's kind of shorter laterals within, flower buds are out to the ends of these branches. And this is important to know because one of the things we really don't want to do with blueberries is we don't want to prune them like it's some sort of hedge. We don't want to come through with hedge shears and just shear the whole thing back, because it'll be a really beautiful plant, but it will probably have few to no fruit, except for the buds that were kind of more interior, still terminal, but in the interior of the plant. Everything on the outside, if you just sheared it, would be gone. So that's something we really, really want to avoid. And certainly when we look at the plants, but hopefully when we talk more about this, we'll be able to, oh yeah, please do. Can we go to the next? Oh yeah, go for it.
It's currently flowering, and they expect to have berries like this year.
If they're flowering, sure, why not? Although I will say, and this could be true for blueberries or huckleberries, really, some people are of the opinion, and I tend to think this, although it's hard to act upon this, I guess I'll say. Some folks are of the opinion that you shouldn't let small plants, whether in a pot or in the ground, that you shouldn't let them bear fruit, because then they're putting a lot of energy into fruit production rather than into vegetative production. And with a younger plant, I will say, even though I want to eat fruit as soon as possible, I really want to grow a big plant first. I want to grow a bigger plant, stronger architecture, better sort of foundational development that then is going to allow me to carry more and more fruit over time. But that's a tough one, because you're looking at your plant, there's flowers, or there's, immature fruit, and you're like, look at that, I'm going to get to eat that in a month or two. And so, you have to kind of make a judgment call. Okay, maybe I'll keep some of that fruit, but then really try to focus on the vegetative growth, but get a little, kind of more short-term pleasure. And then, yeah, but that's a tough call.
You have two questions. One is, can you repeat the questions I asked people online?
Yep. Okay, so first of all, there were a couple questions, so I don't know if we'll be able to correlate exactly, but one was when is winter pruning here in the Santa Cruz area? And I said generally December to February-ish. What was the one after that? It was yeah, the other question, the one that I was just addressing, was what do I do with a younger plant in a container, or it could even be in the ground, that is already starting to bear fruit? Am I going to get fruit? Yes. Should you get fruit is what I was sort of debating, I guess you could say. And there's advantages and disadvantages, but generally I would lean towards let's not have fruit now so I can have more fruit later. And then the other question that just came up was the question around pruning timing for Southern California, where I guess they had kind of a winter this winter, but in general, I'd say that same window is approximately the same for Southern California as here on the Central Coast and even Northern California. We're really looking for when the plants have slowed down as much as possible, regardless of where you live, have slowed down as much as possible from the previous season's growth, and are up to the point where they're beginning but haven't gone too far in current season's growth. Because if I'm trying to, one of my goals, and I haven't really gotten into all the goals of winter pruning yet, but one of my goals I mentioned was reducing fruit load so that the plants simultaneously are growing vegetatively while also carrying and bearing fruit. If I wait until fruit set is really well underway, then a lot of the energy that goes into fruit development's already happened, and maybe at the expense of that vegetative development. Whereas if I'm pruning really kind of up to this sort of bud break window and early flowering window, then not as much energy has yet been expended, and hopefully we're going to get a balance of both vegetative production and fruitfulness this year. It depends on where they are, and then you still also just need to look really closely at them. Not a given, they're both happening, though typically sorry, you all can't see this, but in the far right picture here, it's showing fruit buds for the following year. Really, you have to kind of look in the overall architecture, but what you'll typically see is that fruit bud set is pretty obvious towards the terminal portions of the new laterals and new branches that have been grown. However, they're still going to be round and plump-ish, but they're going to be much, much smaller than like what I'm showing you here, because these ones are already responding to having been exposed to winter chill and being exposed now to increasing day length and so forth. So they're really waking up and starting to get busy. Whereas if we looked at these in October or November, they would be roundish buds, but they wouldn't be nearly this big.
And are they the same size?
No, they're going to be, they're always going to be sort of further and deeper in. So like, okay, so in this first year branch, I've got all these buds. Most of these will probably set fruit. But then there's also latent vegetative buds here that then are going to break and grow these laterals here. And then towards the end of that season, terminally, usually within the last couple inches of any given portion of the branch of new branches that have grown or new laterals that have grown, that's where you get your fruit set. And then vegetative buds are kind of always kind of further down. Now, but late season, we also, where fruit happened, you could also get vegetative buds to develop, not just, I'm not going to just like have my laterals here and fruit from here up, and then only lateral development. This is where new lateral development will be principally, but occasionally you'll see a little bit even where you bore fruit. But usually it's, you got a good example of that here? Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, this is, I'll pass this one around in a second, but maybe folks online can see this. So lateral, thank you, John. This is great. I knew I harvested those for a reason. Lateral, and these are at the point where these particular ones are at the point of petal drop already. There's a couple flowers still in this cluster, but mostly at the point of petal drop. And then right below this, which hopefully you can see online, there's vegetative buds just starting to break. And those are then going to produce this type of lateral here. So yeah, I'll pass that so you can see. On this one here, you can see they're starting to come, same thing down there. So you have kind of at the outer extension fruit set, and then just below that branching, which will then towards the end of this growing season will be where your new fruit set is. Can we go to the next? So, okay, so we've already touched on a few of these things, but I want to think about some of these things more broadly, and then we'll go into a little bit greater depth. So what is our climate here? How much cold do we get? I'm going to talk specifically about chill hours further on, but we have this kind of somewhat mild Mediterranean climate, but it's a really favorable climate that I can grow all sorts of things quite successfully here. The main thing that I have to think about, though, is that blueberries in their native range are basically coming all from places that get fairly consistent summer rain. Now, perhaps that's changing. And, I hear the word drought used in a lot of places other than the West these days, though it's a little bit different version of drought, but nonetheless, growers in the East are becoming increasingly reliant on irrigation, at least as a backstop against inconsistent rains. But here, I know the blueberries need water, and most years we're going to have 6 months, maybe even 8 months with zero rainfall. So we have to think about, to meet the plant's needs, we're really going to need to have access to water and then develop some sort of irrigation infrastructure to support the plant's needs through the growing season. Our plants here are all on drip irrigation, and by and large, I would say that's the way to go. There's not, blueberries aren't susceptible to a ton of fungal diseases, canopy diseases, though if you look closely at these branches, there is some fungal brown spot and so forth, but that's mostly on older leaves that are about to drop off anyway. All the leaves that are still present here, thanks, Jonah, that are still present here, those are, for the most part, are all going to get pushed out and drop on the ground once this current season's crop of leaves emerges. These other branches here, this is a different variety that just is goes more truly dormant here, and it dropped all of its leaves. And when we walk up to the planting up here, you'll see a full range of ones that seemingly are evergreen, although the old leaves will drop this season. And then ones that clearly went 100% dormant and are breaking out of dormancy now. Go. Great question. So most of the growing season we water once a week. In hotter periods, I'll water twice a week. But we're usually trying to deliver about 1 inch of irrigation water per week throughout the dry season. Both early season, that's really important to help fruit development and such. But then later in the season, when the plants have shifted into a little bit more vegetative growth, I still want to have resources there and available for the plants to encourage them along. Now, I said that blueberries are sort of a thirsty crop, but I said, oh, we only give them about an inch of water a week. Well, that inch of water is not dissimilar than like a lot of our vegetable crops and so forth. So that might not sound like a really excessively thirsty crop. And if it were a really excessively thirsty crop, we probably would really rethink whether or not it makes sense for us to be growing them here because of our, finite water supplies. Now this year that seems different, but we seem to be more and more in the dry direction rather than the wet direction like this winter. Which, as a note, this site here averages about 30 inches of rain a year, and we're at 43 inches so far this year. So we're up there. But anyway, one of the ways that we're able to only provide about an inch of water a week, maybe an inch and a half in the hottest portions of the year or during heat spells, is that we have focused at, and I'm going to talk about this with soil preparation and ongoing maintenance, but we have really, really focused on building up organic matter in the root zone of these plants. They come largely from high organic matter, high water table, somewhat boggy environments, but not true bogs usually. And sometimes like in New Hampshire, the wild blueberries that I've seen growing in New Hampshire, they're actually often growing on little sort of dry-ish hummocks around where there's standing water. But most of the blueberry roots are really concentrated in the top 18 inches or so of the soil. So we really work on building organic matter as much as possible within that zone that then is going to allow that inch or so of water that we deliver to stay around for as long as possible so that the plants have access to it, and to keep it there partly by the canopy of the plant, but also partly by a thick wood chip mulch every year to cover and protect the water so that it isn't just evaporating off. So while I think one would generally say they're thirsty plants, I don't think, at least for our management here, we're not treating them as really thirsty plants. We're working on kind of other ways to try to really promote optimal water utilization. Yeah, the other things I'll just say, let's get into sort of broader things to think about here. Frost is fine for blueberries, and I'll talk more about chill hours in a minute. So because a lot of crops you might think, oh, I need a little frost protected or warmer microclimate. In the case of blueberries, that's really not the case for them. In many ways, the colder, the better. Gives you a wider range of varieties that could work for you. But what is really important is that you have ample sunlight. A lot of times blueberries growing in the wild are growing kind of in openings in a coniferous forest and such. And those plants tend to be really kind of lanky, leggy, stretched out plants with not a lot of new growth, not nearly as the kind of concentration of flowers that you can get in a cultivated setting. And that's because they're just not getting enough light. They're reaching and grasping for what little light that they get. And they'll do fine and they'll survive for many years, but they won't be as productive as they could be if you had them in a more favorable sunny location. And so, where they are here, for the most part, they're getting full sun all day long throughout the season. And even in the winter months where they're dormant or just now kind of breaking out of dormancy, they have pretty good exposure. So even when the trajectory of the sun is low, we still get good exposure. You can grow them in more shade, but they just won't be quite as vigorous and productive. And I would say kind of a minimum of 8 or so hours of sun a day is ideal during the main growing season. In terms of wind, the reason that I put that there is simply that the plants themselves aren't particularly vulnerable to wind, but that is going to potentially make them a little bit more thirsty. So if you can be protecting them from wind slightly so that they have less evapotranspiration pressure, that's certainly preferable. And then also if you're in a really windy location, especially this time of year, that may reduce the flight of your pollinators to make it a little harder for the pollinators to come and do the work that you're hoping them to do in terms of producing fruit. But otherwise, wind, I wouldn't say is a huge issue. And then access is just really, that's maybe more of a commercial consideration, but can I get my, if I use any sort of mechanical equipment, can I easily get it there? Can I get my harvested crop from the planting to our coolers? Can we move it out of the sun and into cold storage relatively quickly? Those are going to be something we're always thinking about.
So how far apart do you plant if you're planting a row?
Great question. So you'll see our plants up here. There are basically on about, it's depending on the variety, but 3 or 4 foot apart each. Usually 3 foot apart is gonna give you higher density and a little bit more productivity overall, but like on a acreage scale is also going to then require more plants to fill up the space, and over time a little bit more pruning effort too, to keep them from kind of overgrowing and tangling too much with one another. But yeah, usually most folks will say somewhere in the order of 3 to 4 foot on center in row. And they are very much a multi-trunked plant. So while you may start at that with a single stem, eventually you're largely going to fill the row, or they're not so much from the base, they won't completely run right up against one another, but certainly you can see where the original plants are, but then the canopy of each kind of will really run into one another at that spacing. I'm going to jump to chill hours and soil quality and so forth. Wow, yeah, there's more reformatting here. Interesting. Anyway, the rest of these things I think I will go through in the subsequent slides. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. So yeah, okay. So blueberries basically fall into a few different categories in terms of how much cold winter exposure they actually need. Before I go too far into this, does everybody understand the concept of chill hours, what that is, or does that need a little explanation? No hesitation if you, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you're going to get more than here, and I'll actually get into how you figure this out in a moment. So there's a few different ways in which chill hours are calculated. The simplest method, though, is total cumulative hours below 45 degrees. And then that's calculated at a bunch of different weather stations. If you had your own weather station at 2,000 foot in Bonnie Doon, you could do it yourself. But the California Department of Food and Ag has, or actually that's not true. It's through the UC Davis, I think, is who administers most all of them. There are weather stations and specifically chill hour monitoring stations at many, many locations throughout the state. And actually, we just jump to the next slide and we can come back to this one perhaps. So this is, if you go to the UC Davis, and the address for it is down here at the bottom of this slide, but if you were to type in chill hour calculator, UC pomology, this site would come up, and you'll see here, I've got selected site ID 104 De La Viega. That's the closest monitoring station to our location here. We do actually have a weather station here on the farm, but I don't have real-time access to it. So though it is keeping basically all of this same information. But if you look at the chart at the graph here, you'll see that they essentially, and actually, I guess I cut it off the way I formatted this, but the cumulative chill hours are calculated from November 1st through March 31st each year, the sort of quote unquote winter or cold window. And there's 3 different methods by which they do this. There's what's referred to as the dynamic model, the Utah model, and the just hours below 45, which is what most people use because it's kind of the simplest of the three methods. But you can on this website, you can toggle back and forth from them, and they have you select by county. If this is the page that we would use, but you go, if you're at their homepage, you select by county, and then you look at the stations within your county. The other one that's somewhat close to us, there's another one down in Watsonville, right in the middle of the Pajaro Valley. And typically the chill hours there are somewhere on the order of 20% or so less than what we have here. So this year it says, as I think this was March 8th, I did this screenshot a few days ago. It says we had 1,095 chill hours. The range here in Santa Cruz at this De La Viega site, and you can search all this stuff on this website, is on a really mild winter, as few as like 200, 250 hours of chill, up to about 1,100. And so this this actually is, we're already a little over 1,100. So this has definitely, despite the feeling today and the atmospheric river Pineapple Express deal that we're experiencing, this has actually been a really, really cold winter. So now this, obviously this, there isn't an exact site for everybody's location, but what your task is to look, and the ones that are local to you, and I don't know if you all are from right here in Santa Cruz County, but find the one that's going to be as close as possible to you. And that should give you a reasonable sense of, okay, what's the range of a really cold year to a not so cold year, and what's the average over time. And then within that, once I have that piece of information, I can take a step back to the previous slide, please. And I can decide what varieties are going to really do best for us. So almost everything that we have here are what are referred to as southern high bush varieties, that all originated out of Florida, though most of what we're growing here actually were bred by a nursery up in Oregon called Fall Creek Nursery. But they're all in the mid to kind of higher end of the low chill category. And what we have seen is that most winters, because when we first planted this, we had several that were more on the high chill end of the spectrum. And a lot of winters, we just didn't get enough cold for them. And then they would bloom. They wouldn't bloom until super late because they're still like waiting for a little more cold influence to break out of dormancy. And then when they did bloom, they would tend to have a much smaller bloom, more erratic and small set, because they're just not varieties that were super well suited to our average year. Now, a year like this, they're all going to be plenty happy because there's plenty of cold. But we really, if you want to have as consistent a production as possible, figuring out what is my typical chill hours in my region, my space, and then, taking, if there isn't something that's going to give you, for example, 2,000 feet at Bonnie Doon, you may have to try to guesstimate, okay, well, what has my winter been like compared to what this chart is showing, and do I have 20% more chill hours? Do I have even 30-40% more chill hours than what's here? Because I don't know of any accessible, like where the information is accessible, like for in Bonnie Doon. Maybe Jana does, or yeah. That's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't think so, but I'm not certain about that. Yeah, that's a really good question though, because the rabbit eyes tend to require very little winter chill to be good and productive, but I'm not certain about Biloxi and these others. So with what we have found for us, given that we typically in most winters, like 700 chill hours or so is the average. We really do well with a wide range of varieties, but not the high chill ones. And then the no chill, a no chill variety like Biloxi, for example. So a lot of people are growing that in this area and like it. It's a pretty productive plant. I don't personally think it's the most flavorful, but they're really beautiful and productive plants. And certainly if you're further south, they would be a good choice for you. Is there another?
Yeah, grow rabbit eye, tasty and
Okay, so we don't grow any rabbit eye here. All of the varieties we have are southern high bush varieties that are the Vaccinium corymbosum. And we originally started with a couple of northern high bush varieties too, Duke in particular, and Elliott. And when we have a good winter, those ones do really well and we like them, but in other winters, they're just not as reliable. But we don't grow any, to your question, we don't grow any rabbit eye here. The ones that I have tasted in other places, I actually thought the flavor was pretty good overall. And a little bit small, generally a little bit smaller fruit, but really, really nice quality fruit by and large. It's a different species. I believe it's Vaccinium ashii. Still a blueberry, although, you know, Vaccinium is also the genus, both for cranberries and huckleberries as well, but it still makes a blue, round blue blueberry-like fruit. Yeah.
What are the most common ones you see there?
No idea actually what's in the grocery. I do know, yeah, so there's a lot of there's actually a variety called San Joaquin that is grown. So Tulare in San Joaquin County in the southern Central Valley is where there's the kind of largest blueberry plantings in California. And there's actually a variety called San Joaquin that is planted there on really, really extensive tracts. So my guess is that a lot of that is it's not like farmers market, local market scale production. So my guess is that that's certainly one of the varieties you would see in the supermarket in the summer here. But like right now, varieties coming out of South America, out of Chile and so forth, I'm not sure whose those would be. Probably some overlap with what we grow though. Let's see. So yeah, I would just encourage you, think about all things around your sort of, do I have good sun exposure? Is it not too windy? And then what are my chill hours? And that's gonna help inform, one, can I grow blueberries reasonably well? And then two, what types or what varieties might I be best off choosing? And can we go to the next slide and we'll get into some other really key, actually next after that, sorry. Oh, that's really interesting. None of this happened. It's a lot of yeah. I actually looked at it all this morning and it was clean. This is interesting. Okay, well, we'll look at this picture like this. I love technology. So yeah, it's for folks online and for all of you here, a cleaned up version of this will come to you for reference. We'll send it out as a PDF to everybody. But one of the things I really want to talk about is soil and soil pH, because apart from your climate and sunlight exposure and so forth, probably, and perhaps even more important than those things, is that we really, really have to have low pH soils or soil mixes if you're growing in a container. Low pH for blueberries to prosper. They are truly an acid-loving plant. And when I say low pH, most sources will tell you they should be somewhere in the order of 4.5 to 5.0 pH, which is exponentially lower than most of our vegetable crops thrive in kind of a near neutral 6.8 to 7 range. And to get all the way down to 4.5 is quite a task, actually. You can imagine in some of the, in the hummocks in a coniferous forest, the huckleberries growing amidst the redwoods and Doug firs and so forth. They're typically grown, they're in their native locations, their natural sites, they're in really acidic soils. And that's the kind of environment that we need to create when we're thinking about planting blueberries. So this particular slide is one way to go about this, or one way to think about this. If you just have a backyard patio or a balcony, or just don't have suitable in-ground place, you can create a suitable growing environment in a 15-gallon pot or in a half wine barrel, something like that, and still do really, really well with blueberries. And this same mix could also be used in kind of a boxed bed type of situation, and then can be used in an in-ground setting. In this picture, if it were upright, was supposed to show you actually kind of this setting at this is at my house just the other day, which is why it looks just like today, so wet. And it's a little hard to see, but the blueberries that are under that kind of line of posts or trellis they're about 5 years old, and they're growing in a plant, essentially a planting mix. I excavated about 1 foot of soil out of the ground there, the native soil, and then I used that to mound up other trees and so forth in the area. And then I came back in with this exact recipe here, which is 1/3 peat moss, 1/3 compost, 1/3 coniferous wood chips. This was redwood wood chips. Some people might ask, instead of peat moss, can I use cocoa peat or coir? That would also work, although it is not quite as acidic as peat moss actually is. It's only mildly acidic, as opposed to peat moss being highly acidic. So those 3 ingredients would get mixed as thoroughly as possible, and then either filling your planter beds, your containers, or going right back into the ground in a setting like this. I actually, in this case, and I think because blueberries tend to run their roots fairly wide, but not so deep, I actually dug the whole width of the bed is about 3 foot wide, and this particular bed is 36 feet long. You could, if you're only planting a couple of plants, then a generous size planting hole can be helpful. And I will say, this is really a different approach. If you've done a workshop with Oren and talked about planting fruit trees and so forth, one of the things we tend to I'm sure would have heard from him, and that we tend to steer away from, is greatly amending a planting hole and then sticking your new tree in there. And then you essentially have created this really nice container environment, but once the tree roots get out to the edge of that hole and your unimproved native soil, that it tends to be sort of plants have a disincentive, the trees have a disincentive to run into that unimproved native soil, and will tend to be more stuck in your highly improved soil. And that might be fine for the first few years, but over time, they're going to be more dependent on ongoing inputs, and then also more water dependent. They're not going to be spreading their root system as widely and as deeply as they would otherwise, because of having the sort of benefit of this highly improved environment. With blueberries, I think about that really differently, and it's basically because of their dependence on low pH and high organic matter. Our soils here, the the grassland soil that our blueberries are planted in is like undisturbed soils, maybe 3.5% organic matter. And blueberries really would like to be more like in the 15 to 20% or more. The process of our planting here, we did a little bit different. This recipe, what I'll call recipe, this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. This is practical on a really small scale. I have like a dozen plants at home. And so, there was certainly some cost in purchasing a couple bales of peat moss, and wood chips were free. Compost was compost that I made, but it's a lot of brought in materials. With our plantings up here, we didn't use the same peat moss approach. We didn't do quite as much in terms of some imported ingredients, but just because it was a larger scale, tried to take a less expensive approach. So the ground up here, the rows were cover cropped for 2 full seasons beforehand, and then all that organic matter was mowed and incorporated back into the soil. And then a small amount of peat moss, a huge amount of coniferous wood chips, and a huge amount of compost that we had produced on site were blended into the soil, along with soil sulfur and elemental sulfur. The elemental sulfur in particular, in the presence of your soil biological community, that material is broken down and does a tremendous job of reducing soil pH. We use a particular brand called Tiger 90, but it also, I think, only comes in like 50-pound bags, so that may be impractical. There's other sources, because that's probably more than most folks would end up needing for home. Go ahead. Yeah. You could, but you don't need to. And like in my planting at home where I did this, I excavated not quite a foot of soil, but about a foot of soil. And I mentioned that most blueberries are probably going to root at least 18 inches deep. So they're certainly rooting down and into the native soil, but most of the soil root zone is really just sort of this, what I'll call planting mix. The question, by the way, for that was, do you add soil into this planting mix? And essentially no, but some people would like to, just because I don't think you need to, but you certainly can, because using your own native soil is then going to give you more volume. You're going to have to purchase less other material. Yeah, absolutely. So they definitely, like, if you go to the garden center or San Lorenzo, you can buy planting mixes for containers that are quote unquote acid mixes that are like designed for azaleas, rhododendrons, and other acidic loving plants. And those are suitable as well. This is just this is kind of a simple, fairly straightforward recipe. And especially when you consider that you can probably get the wood chips for free, that helps to reduce some of the cost if you're working on a little bit larger question. And again, I'm good at repeating the questions after the fact. Could you buy an acid planting mix like that you could get at a garden center? And as I said, yes. You had a question that I think maybe you all did too. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I mean, definitely the fir and the redwood are going to be a little bit more acidic, but even the organic matter, the oak is slightly acidic, and the organic matter that you get from it is tremendously useful. And especially if that's in the mix with the other things. So yeah, for sure. Let me go over here and then I'll circle back to you. Yes, we do. And in fact, Jessica, can you go probably 1 or 2 slides forward here? Let me see. Well, yeah, at the bottom, this is kind of the next, can you go to the next one? Oh, sorry, back two, right there, stop there. So that's kind of a text heavy one, but I did, in the bottom of this, it says pH strips. Yeah, you can get pH strips online. You could also buy a pH meter. We have a pH meter that we use. And so there's two ways in which we think about using that. We will both take some of our mix, in this case, the soil up here, or that planting mix that I was suggesting. And we'll take that and then put that in solution with a, I want to say diluted water. That's not, what's the word? What do you call that water that you would put in? Distilled water. Thank you. With distilled water, and then test the pH of that. So then we're getting a sense, a kind of a quick sense of what our soil is like. You can also, I'm really bummed that those slides are all goofy, but you can also send your soil in for soil samples, both to get to a soil lab to get a nutrient analysis of what you've got, get a sense of your organic matter percentage, and with that, you're always going to learn about your pH as well. The other thing that we do, though, and will you go back to the previous, maybe one slide back? Yeah, there. Okay, so this is the way that interesting, more unformatting. Okay, great. Sorry, I should probably stop saying that. The main thing that we do, well, we do all of the a whole set of annual steps. If you look at the second bullet point here, we apply elemental sulfur. We apply on a rate of about the equivalent of about 200 pounds per acre. And if you do the math, that gets you into only about a half a pound per 100 square feet. So it's not very much biome, or not very much volume, but it has tremendous effect as the soil biology starts to break that material down in the root zone. But then the other thing that we do on this annual basis is we apply a new round of compost, a new round of granular fertilizer, and an acid or even citrus type. A fertilizer that would be suitable for rhododendrons and azaleas would be great. A citrus type fertilizer, citrus and avo mixes, you'll often see those are also good blends for blueberries. And then we add more wood chips. So that goes on a regular basis. On a home scale, you might also consider, and this is certainly practical if you're working in pots and raised beds and stuff, are possibly achievable, but trying to get about 1 tablespoon of regular distilled white vinegar, 1 tablespoon per gallon into your water, into your irrigation. We accomplished that with this device that's in this picture here. That's what's called a fertilizer injector. It's a brand called Dosatron. Probably a little bit more infrastructure than you might want to invest in for a small scale operation at home. But essentially what this thing is doing in that white bucket there is actually a commercial grade 20% vinegar. Your vinegar that you would buy at the store is usually only about 5%. This is a much more concentrated vinegar. It is siphoned or drawn into the irrigation water, blended with it, and this has an adjustable, you can adjust it to different mix rates, and then pushed back into the irrigation system as vinegar and water. And so where we're testing in particular, because really trying to maintain low pH, especially with heavy winter rains and so forth, we're going to get anything that we've applied, we're also potentially losing and leaching at this time of year. So throughout, I mentioned we're going to apply roughly an inch of water per week through the growing season. That is all going to be an acidified water. And then I use our pH meter. I'll put a series of small cups under the drip line in a bunch of different locations. And then I'll take a pH meter, and after the irrigation with vinegar has been running for a while, I will take the pH meter and then go test what's coming out and what's essentially going to become the soil solution, the place at which the plants have access to water and nutrients. And our water here is typically about 7.0 to 7.2 pH. When we inject vinegar, I'm really trying to bring it down to about 4.5. And on a tablespoon per gallon, that's approximately the equivalent. But for the last couple of years, we had been buying, let me back up a little bit. So this method, the planting that we have here was originally part of a USDA trial, looking at a bunch of different varieties to try to think about is commercial blueberry production, organic or conventional, is that suitable for the Central Coast, and what types of varieties would really be appropriate. And at the time that this was first planted about 15 years ago, there was almost no commercial blueberries in this immediate area. At the time, in addition to all the things around the soil amendments that I mentioned, the primary thinking about how does one maintain a more acidic environment, it was this idea of injecting vinegar into the system to have an acidic water. Currently, most growers in this area who are on a commercial scale, who are trying to acidify their water, they have actually got a new and much less expensive way to do this. And that's using something called a sulfur burner, which basically takes elemental sulfur exposed with oxygen and heat, and then it converts that into a sulfurous acid that then can be blended back into the irrigation water. This infrastructure that you see here, all the PVC and the injector and so forth, there's maybe $400 or so, $450 worth of parts there. So that's not, certainly for a small scale production, it's probably a little expensive for home, but that's not super expensive. But we use at least 50 gallons of vinegar a year, and that vinegar costs us about $500. It's about $250, current price is about $250 for the vinegar and about $250 to get it here by truck. So that's actually a really expensive input. People who are using the sulfur burner approach, a comparable setup that could do several acres would be more like $3,000 or $4,000 for the infrastructure, but then maybe $50 to $100 a year in inputs in buying elemental sulfur, and then burning that and converting it into the sulfurous acid. So higher startup cost, much lower costs over time, and fairly trouble-free in terms of maintenance, which is also true with this system. But yeah, our annual costs for the inputs are much, much higher. Yeah. Every single water. Yeah. And so what I do what I was starting to say actually is, so we have a fairly expensive cost of buying in this vinegar. In collaboration with one of our fellow staff, we started making our own vinegar from like our apple droppings and so forth in the fall. And what we ended up finding with that was two things. We were only able to make with the processes that we were using, only be able to make about a 7% vinegar, as opposed to what we're buying, which is 20%. And so we needed a lot more volume to push the water down to the same source, but we were making it ourselves, so the cost was lower. But I had to go back in, and using our pH meter and such, I had to recalibrate our injection rate so that we were drawing a lot more vinegar to get to that same 4.5 pH. But then the other thing is, at least with our methodology, the vinegar that we were producing had a ton of sediment and particulate matter in it. And it meant that I then was spending a lot of time trying to filter it so that I then didn't clog up my irrigation system. And so at least for this coming year, we're going back to buying vinegar, which I sort of have mixed feelings about, but we didn't produce any vinegar because we weren't sure we're really going to be able to produce a high enough quality, somewhat sediment-free vinegar with limited labor time and such.
So, but I understand one thing is vinegar based on the 20%, based on the 5%.
That's actually based on the 5%. Yeah, because that's your that's what's going to be more available to most people unless you decide you need a 50 gallon or 50 gallon drum. Yeah. If you grow or if you throw a handful of sulfur on each plant, I would say a conservative handful, not a heaping handful. But if you grow the question was how much sulfur and how frequent. I would say absolutely once a year and ideally twice a year, once somewhere in the now-ish window as the plants are starting to wake up, and then again in May or June. Putting the material there now is helpful because there isn't as much vegetation. It's a little easier to access the soil zone. It fits with everything else that I'm thinking about in terms of applying compost, applying granular fertilizer, applying more wood chips. But the reality of it is that soil sulfur, it's dependent on biological activity to really break down. And most of the biological activity doesn't really ramp up until our soils get into the mid 60s or low 70s temperature range. And we're certainly not there yet. So while I've put the material there because it fits kind of the timing, that stuff isn't probably going to start becoming available till April or May. And then we would do a second application at that time frame to try to cover much of the rest of the primary growing season. It's a little bit different, though. It is also something that people use because it can help with pH as well. It's my experience with it is certainly more limited, but it seems like you need more volume, and then you potentially risk putting too much sodium in the system as well. Although blueberries can tolerate some sodium. Yeah. So coffee grounds are really acidic, and that's a great amendment for sure. Yeah, the more the merrier, because it's rich organic matter, it's acidic organic matter, and it's certainly going to be beneficial. Jessica, were there other questions or go ahead.
Back to the moss, is the point of that just for the soil, or are there other benefits? Like if your soil is already on the acidic side, would you still
so peat moss is really expensive, and it's not despite what you might read on like the Canadian Peat Bog Producers Association website, it is not a sustainable ingredient. It's something that's being strip mined essentially, and it's a super valuable and useful ingredient, but there's a lot of ecological impact and carbon loss and such in the process. So it is something that if you can use less of it because you're already in an acidic environment, I would highly, highly suggest using less. And if you're already in an acidic environment, then perhaps cocoa peat might serve some of the same purpose without as much of the emphasis on the pH reduction. Because ultimately what we're trying to do with the peat moss and also with cocoa peat, is two things. We're trying to really provide acidic material that's going to help acidify the soil root zone. And then we're also trying to provide something that is high in organic matter that's going to really help hold nutrients. And peat moss has a fairly high cation exchange capacity too, so it helps keep nutrients in place longer for the plants to have better access to them, less likely to be leached away. Peat moss will give you all of the cocoa peat will give you all of that organic matter benefit in terms of moisture retention, and a porous environment for the roots to really prosper in, won't give you as much benefit in terms of pH reduction, nor in terms of cation exchange benefit. That said, it's still a valuable ingredient, and arguably, although I'm not 100% convinced of this, but arguably a more sustainable product than peat moss, because it's something that's a byproduct of an existing industry, you know, and both are being shipped from very, very far away, though. You know, there's definitely an energy cost to get them to us here on the West Coast. Let's go to the next, actually, yeah, okay. So I've kind of covered some of this, but I just want to run through this again. In terms of the things that we think about doing, and why do these slide? The things that we think about doing each year are essentially listed here. Winter pruning, somewhere in the November to February window for us in our climate. We also try to deliver this kind of quote unquote winter layer cake, and it's a lot easier to do after you've pruned. And this is not dissimilar to my planting recipe, but this is an ongoing kind of layered inputs on top of the existing planting. Compost, potentially more peat moss or cocoa. We don't do that here at my planting at home because it's smaller. I do. But I've also got a really alkaline native soil, even more so than what we have here. But you might or might not choose to do that with an established planting. Soil sulfur annually, granular fertilizer annually. And these might be things that you, if you have the time and resources, you might actually do twice, as I said, once now-ish and again May-ish. And then capping that all off with a thick layer of wood chips. And one thing I wanted to mention about this is if you've grown fruit trees and citrus and others, you know, very often we talk about, even when we recommend mulching and so forth and building up organic matter under the drip line, we're always really careful not to build material up right on the trunk of the trees, because sometimes that can invite voles, first of all, to come and damage your trunk and your vascular system, but also too much material mounded up on the trunks of most trees can cause more rootstock sprouting, and you don't want the rootstock. You want the cultivated variety that's above. That is not a concern with blueberries. They're a multi-trunk plant. They're pushing up new stalks naturally from below ground, and adding more organic matter around the base of the plant that actually just helps facilitate more new shoot production. So think about this really differently than many other fruit trees where we're like, okay, yes, organic matter, but not, you know, keep myself a nice buffer around my trunk. But I don't think that at all with blueberries. Not that I'm aware of, maybe, but not that I'm aware of, and certainly not any of the varieties that we're growing here. Go ahead. Yeah. Yes, and yes, we do a lot of weeding. In fact, when we walk up here, you'll see we have weeded, did kind of a coarse weeding through there. Our alleyways between the plants, between the rows, are quite weedy. They're just weedy, grassy, and they get mowed or weed whacked 2, 3, maybe this year, maybe 4 times. We'll see. It's already been once, and we're pretty much due for a second one. But under the plants I don't really worry about that in the alleys. I don't worry about weeds in the alleys because I'm not watering there and I'm not putting any resources there, but I do try to mow or weed whack and keep seed set down. But under the plants themselves, I'm putting all this time and energy into trying to support those plants, and I don't want to be supporting weed populations. So we're as thorough as we can be. We try to be pretty thorough about weeding in row, but not in the alleys. It depends on what we have access to. We usually get the citrus and avo mix from California Organic Fertilizers, but we haven't been able to get that regularly recently. So this year we actually used the citrus and avo mix from Down to Earth, because I just ran down to San Lorenzo and bought it there. The Gardener in Bloom makes an acid an organic acid loving plant mix, and that's a nice one as well. And they make a citrus and fruit tree one. Ultimately, you're looking for higher nitrogen and then a reasonable amount of phosphorus and potassium. I think the one that we used this year, I think it was 835 or 837, somewhere in that 8 or 9% nitrogen, 234-ish percent phosphorus, and 5 to 7 potassium. Most anybody in that range is probably going to be good, and especially if it was one designed for more acid loving plants.
Are these grown low something, the trellises? Partners with that same seed?
So what I usually actually have here, and I just pulled them all out and gonna replant, is actually a kind of a carpet on the berm, sort of on the sides, a carpet of alpine strawberries that they don't absolutely need the acidic environment, but they seem to be perfectly happy in it. So usually I have kind of a continuous strip down the side. In our planting up here, we don't have any there are actually a scattering of native wild strawberry growing there, but we haven't deliberately planted anything. Sometimes people do like beneficial insect habitat strips and so forth in the alleys in between, or even on the sides of berms, and that can be useful. You just don't want to limit, you don't want to be blocking sunlight and air circulation and such within the canopy with any companion planting. So we use cardboard as in this kind of layer cake idea that I have listed here. Actually, cardboard would often be the last. This is sort of from bottom to the top of this list, I guess, would actually be the bottom, so we could flip-flop this. But the wood chips, we would normally don't do that specifically in the blueberries, mostly just because they are a multi-trunk plant and I'm wanting to leave space for new stems to come up, and I don't want to obstruct them. Now and the cardboard will, just as it's going to obstruct the weeds, it's also, before it breaks down, it's also going to obstruct the blueberries from coming up. Now, instead of trying to mulch right up to the plants with the cardboard, though, perhaps, if I'm not sure, like if I am on somewhat of a mound, I could cardboard down the sides, but not cardboard in the center where my new shoots would come. And that might help with, I shouldn't say might help, that would definitely help with weed abatement on the sides, and also moisture conservation and building organic matter over time. So the only concern or caveat, as I said, would just be trying to make sure that your cardboard doesn't obstruct your new shoots, which is your future fruit. But otherwise, if you can kind of go to the edges and get some of that same benefit, I think that's a really great way to go. Okay, so a couple other things here, because I want to run through a few more things. So I mentioned this idea of ongoing acidification. That could be through your sulfur inputs, and a couple plus times a year. It could be through injecting vinegar into your system. In my home system, I don't actually apply any vinegar, just for kind of sake of time and a whole nother step. But I actually feel like in watching these plants over the years, I actually feel like probably what I really should be doing is at least periodically, to I think your question of how often do you do it, we put vinegar in all the time here, but I think at home probably I should set it up so that I could inject, even with just like one of those little siphon, the little brass ones that you can buy are like $10 or $15, where it sucks the vinegar out of a bucket. I probably should do that at least a few times a year, and it probably would make for stronger, healthier plants at home. But I've focused more on like this kind of planting mix idea, trying to really make that as acidic as possible, rather than kind of ongoing acidification. Pest and disease monitoring is going to be really important with all crops. I've actually found with blueberries, it's only moderately important. And we've got a slide here that I'll show you in a sec of a couple pests to come to. But pest and disease monitoring, that would be something we want to think about all year. But hopefully isn't going to be something you have to do a ton about. I think the most important thing ultimately is to harvest and enjoy the fruit that you're growing, and eat it and enjoy it, share it with your friends and family. And then to the subject of summer pruning, I mentioned earlier that some folks really strongly favor summer pruning. And I think summer pruning is tremendously beneficial, especially to clean up and get rid of some of the things that you might otherwise have to do in the winter. It's also one of our aims with winter pruning. So we're trying to promote new vigorous growth, new future fruitfulness. We're trying to remove any dead, diseased, damaged, disoriented material. We're trying to make sure that there's sunlight and air movement, sunlight infiltration and air circulation throughout the canopy. And we're also trying to reduce fruit set. It's a little bit harder to see exactly what the plants are going to look like in the summer in the middle of the winter, because many of our varieties have dropped their leaves, and you're like, well, it looks pretty dense, but I can't tell quite how dense it is because I don't have all my leaves. And so summer can be a really good way, even if you don't summer prune, to really try to track, okay, how crowded and dense are these plants, and how am I going to translate that into my winter pruning? Or if you have the time and wherewithal to do some of that canopy cleaning, canopy thinning in the summer months, rather than in the winter when it's a little harder. The leaves are down, but it's a little harder to see the summer look of things.
You worry about branches that are touching each other?
Yes and no. So in most fruit tree pruning, we really think about, a lot of the pruning is about managing against crossing and overlapping and touching. Blueberries just grow so much more densely and prosper even when they're quite dense. So we definitely do, and that's one of the things I'll show you up here, we definitely do some canopy thinning to reduce crowding, but we're not trying to eliminate crowding the way you might with like an apple tree. There was an online question, or?
Varieties are kind of our favorite at the farm, and which varieties?
They're largely the same. And I'll also say these are, the varieties that we have here. There are certainly other varieties out there that are good varieties that we just aren't growing. But like that, actually the San Joaquin variety that I mentioned that's grown in the Central Valley and is actually being grown on some operations in the Pajaro Valley. If we do a new planting in the future, I actually want to trial some of those here and see how well they do here. Because if they're doing well in the Pajaro Valley, they're probably going to do pretty well for us here. The varieties that we tend to like the most here, both from fruitfulness as well as flavor, tend to be South Moon, Jewel, Reveille. Those are probably my three favorites, but a lot of people also, when we have these here, a lot of people really like O'Neill. Just got a thumbs up from Jono on that. I don't know, who else do you really like, Jono? Do you? O'Neill, yeah. And O'Neill's a great variety in terms of flavor. Really, really classic, kind of sweet and tart, almost perfumey flavor. But for us here, it seems to want a little bit more chill than we get in most winters. So fruit yield is inconsistent from year to year. probably our #1 variety overall is really South Moon in terms of flavor, productivity, abundance of fruit produced, and then consistency from year to year. But Jewel is a great variety as well. Yeah, and yeah, it's a it's a hard call though too though, because everybody, like, for many years when we were first doing trials here, we would do taste testing, and what everybody prefers is a little bit different. And it's also in terms of in relation to your palate. And then it's also kind of interesting in that when you do a taste testing, you know, you got to assemble all this fruit on one particular day, right? And if you've got 15 varieties of fruit, I can pretty much guarantee they're not all equally ripe and at their peak on that one day of your testing. So you almost, and we never were consistent enough with this, but if you really wanted to get a more thorough picture, you really would need to think about multiple side-by-side testings across the season. It's a little hard to say, okay, we're going to test the South Moons now, and then we're going to try to be objective and say, oh, I'm eating the O'Neills later and I'm eating the Sharp Blues later. Now, how do they, you kind of have to taste them on the same day, but they're not all at the same place on the same day. Because it's kind of hard to, you know, oh, I remember that the South Moon was better. Well, maybe, but was I just in a better mood that day? Or, you know, who knows? So, yeah. Can we go on to the next slide here? So I just want to mention real briefly a couple of pest issues. Scale, which is what you see in this picture here. It's basically like an armored version of an aphid. They latch on to usually younger stems, and they have rasping, sucking mouth parts. And then they have this, most scales have kind of, they're referred to as an armored scale because they have this kind of waxy cuticle on the outside. That is a problem that some folks have with blueberries. We've never seen any presence of scale here, but it is something to be on the lookout for. Usually if you have scale, you'll see ants crawling all through your canopy. Whenever you have aphids, mealybugs, scale, there's almost always ants also present up and in the canopy of your plants because they're feeding upon, and you'll notice usually because they're moving fast, you usually notice the ants first. And that's really useful to then say, oh, I need to focus in a little bit closer and think about the scale, and or think about who might be there, see if I can identify who my problem might be, and then see about some sort of control method. In the case of scale, it's fairly difficult because it self-protects with that hard shell that it's got. So we would typically take like Q-tips if you want to see it earlier so you can intervene earlier so you don't have a bigger problem. And that's where regular monitoring and observation or scouting is really valuable. But either with a stiff hose, you can just blast it off, or you could take like rubbing alcohol and Q-tips and rub them down. Sometimes if it's not too much, I'll even just literally just squash them with my fingers and then spray like safer soap on there, which is real mild. But once you've broken up their shells, then they're really vulnerable. We haven't used that for scale, but I have heard from several other folks that it's been successful for them. Yeah, it's basically smothers them. Yeah. Yeah. And if we ever do have a significant outbreak, that's, you know, so in our, as an organic production operation, all your inputs have to be on your organic production plan. And that oil is on our list of approved inputs, though we haven't used it for this yet. But it's Monterey horticultural oil. Yeah, it's just a mild mineral oil. Spotted wing Drosophila, which can be a problem with some other crops, is another one that some people have. We have not yet seen any issues with that here. We did have, when light brown apple moth was a really big deal, or was first coming on, and when it was thought to be like this could devastate all sorts of industries in California. The USDA, this picture on the right is actually a crew of USDA inspectors inspecting our harvested fruit. They were coming through a couple times a week, a big crew of them, because the light brown apple moth can be on the plants, but it can also be in the fruit. And obviously the fruit, our fruit was just going locally, but if the fruit's being shipped more widely, then potentially you're dispersing light brown apple moth to new locations that it hasn't yet established itself. So they were looking really, really carefully. And at one point though, they literally were inspecting every single fruit. Like we would have like 40 flats of fruit harvested and they'd piece through every single one of them for a while. And at one point I just didn't go over real well, but I said, well, could you all maybe just harvest the fruit too? And then you could just look at it as you're harvesting. That'll save us some time. And they didn't like that very much. And it was probably an unnecessary comment, but then they backed off and then they were like, okay, we're just going to look at 1 or 2 flats out of your whole harvest. And then after a while, not that light brown apple moth hasn't caused some damage, but I think ultimately the concern that was initially really out that, wow, this is going to be devastating, proved not to be as problematic. And so it's still something to be aware of, but perhaps not. Oh.
So does that mean that the 1 year
Okay, so the question was, do we do any sort of have an annual spraying program for the blueberries as we might with apples or other fruit tree crops? The answer to that is actually no. We don't do any sort of calendarized or consistent and regular spraying, 0 for the blueberries, only based on kind of scouting and observation. And then if we do, real targeted intervention, hopefully long before a problem has spread. But thankfully with the blueberries, we're not seeing any like widespread, throughout the canopy, throughout the planting problems that would require that sort of ongoing, more extensive approach. So if you ask me that in a few more years, I might have a different answer, but after this planting being here for 15 plus years, maybe longer than that, yeah, we haven't had any issues like that. Jessica, next slide. Go ahead. Deer and gophers. I already talked about some of this too. So deer, huge problem for sure. Deer would love to mow. They would love to graze your plants and in the process eat all of that terminal growth that is going to be next season's fruit and so forth. So deer exclusion, I would say, is absolutely imperative. And yeah, absolutely imperative. And the whole farm is fenced. So we don't have the blueberries fenced exclusively for deer, for another reason, which I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, whether farm scale or garden scale, if you've got marauding deer, they would be really happy to eat your blueberries. So keeping them out, critical, I would say. Gophers, we have a rather abundant gopher population, and we lose, of all the different annual crops and so forth that we grow, despite gopher snakes, hawks, owls, bobcats, coyotes, all being on the farm. And we don't have any domestic cats now, but in the past we've also had domestic cats and a bunch of and then also doing a lot of trapping. Despite all of those natural and human interventions, we literally lose thousands upon thousands of crop plants a year to gophers, despite tremendous effort against that and trying to enhance natural predators and such. That said, the only time I've ever had problems with the blueberries and lost plants is young brand new plants. So I would say, in the first year or two of their establishment. So I would say being really proactive about prevention and trapping, if trapping is the thing you can do. If you're, some people don't want to trap, and I get that. But if you do trap, then I would say you want to be really on top of trapping in the first couple of years when you have a less extensive plant that doesn't have as much root system, so that because I see gophers in our plants, but I don't see any plant loss. And I think maybe they're grazing a little bit of roots here and there, but there's so much other stuff that they seem to leave the established plants alone. Pardon? Possibly not. Yeah, possibly that environment is less favorable for them. The other thing, though, that for us is a huge concern and probably is going to be a concern for most people at home is birds. And our whole planting, it's kind of all cattywampus right now, but our whole planting has a kind of post and wire assembly with bird netting over it to try to keep the birds out. And it excludes most of the birds, but amazingly, small and large birds still, some still find their way in. Right now, the sides are all up and they have free access because there's no fruit. I'm not worried about the birds with the vegetative portions of things. But during the fruiting season, we drop all the nets down. We really try to like secure it as best as possible. And that trellis and the pictures you saw from my house there, that trellis was actually just purely to support the bird netting. Although I, unfortunately, at home, am finding I have another, perhaps two other challenges to address, which is ground squirrels and rabbits. It seems that at my house, and we have tons of ground squirrels here, but I haven't seen this here, but at my house, ground squirrels just chew right through my netting, and then they go and eat the fruit, and then the rabbits come through the holes that the ground squirrels chewed. So you got some other furry critters. In fact, I haven't done anything yet, but I'm actually thinking that I'm gonna basically put a rigid fencing around the bottom that the ground squirrels can't just readily chew right through this year. Or maybe even use that trellis and have some sort of seasonal rigid panels that the ground squirrels can't go. I love blueberries, but how much effort do I want to put into protecting them is a question mark. And the netting's pretty easy. You got the trellis posts, you throw it up, you secure it down, and up until this last year, it worked really well. But for some reason, last summer, the ground squirrels decided the netting wasn't good enough to keep them out. So yeah, I've been hemming and hawing quite a bit. Like, do I do something more extensive? Do I build some kind of rigid panels, or do I just see if last year was an anomaly? Unfortunately, I don't think it was an anomaly. I think that most of the critters have a really good memory, as well as intergenerational memory, to pass on like where the goods are to the next generation. So Jono, did you have a question?
Alternatives to the netting for bird control.
So we haven't really seen anything totally effective in a lot of those large scale commercial plantings where netting multiple acres wouldn't be practical. You'll see all sorts of things that may or may not work, but like that kind of red and silver mylar strips hanging and sort of dangling in the wind. I've seen one ranch that had old compact discs like spinning in the wind. Kind of that reflective, all that shiny light is supposed to deter the birds. And then much like they do in other orchard settings, sometimes even like sounds of predatory birds, of hawks and owls, and playing recordings, or even like cannon blasts. I don't know if any of that really works that well, though. And I think in the case of these massive orchards or massive blueberry plantings, they're not netting and they're losing some fruit, but they also have so much fruit that maybe some is tolerable. Whereas our little 1/10 of an acre planting with the incredible bird population that we have here could very quickly be overwhelmed. So, yeah. I think I talked about most all of this in terms of pruning, so I won't reiterate this slide. I think I jumped to this earlier, but and we're going to go up in just a minute. We're going to leave here and go up and look at our plantings. But again, we're trying to promote vigor, promote new growth, get sunlight, get air, reduce excessive fruit load, so we get more vegetative growth for future years. Get rid of dead, disease, damaged, disoriented is ultimately our goal. We go to the next slide, and I think we're going to try to kind of go through the rest of these. I did this earlier, but I wanted to have this in here for your reference for when you get shared this. This image hopefully gives you a pretty good sense of that, along with the pictures I showed earlier of the kind of plump fruit buds that are a compound bud that is multiple flowers, and then these vegetative buds as well. And this is a little bit of a before and after look of what a blueberry planting might look like. You'll notice on the left, many canes, some kind of smaller, kind of more spindly, though branched canes at the base. This right here is was the equivalent, sort of an equivalent of that. This is one that I pruned from the base, actually right next to this much bigger one. I also pruned this one. This one was kind of a little bit higher up in the canopy, but these are examples of things like somewhat weak growth down at the base of the plant, and especially if this wasn't here, if it was like weaker growth like that, I 100% would get rid of that in the base of a plant. In this case, I actually cut it in part because I just wanted to show you kind of range of growth you might get. Anytime you see this type of material, this would be more up in the middle of the canopy. There's only a tiny bit of fruit potential on here, and there's a bunch of older dead branches in here. So this is the kind of thing, even though I said to you earlier, oh, we're not totally trying to get rid of crossing and such, this is just kind of unnecessary crowding that's not doing, I'm barely going to get any fruit from it, and I'm mostly just going to kind of limit light and air circulation with something like this. But our normal steps for pruning, and we'll look at this outdoors with folks here in a minute. Our normal steps for pruning, we're going to go in, we're going to identify first who's the biggest, oldest cane that if I make one cut is going to have the most dramatic effect in terms of changing the look of that plant and opening that plant up. And you can kind of see in the right-hand image, it's probably the little stub on the right side there is what's supposed to be shown in that illustration. So for us, we think about step one, what's one or maybe two bigger canes that I'm going to cut out and remove, and have a fairly dramatic effect. And then the second thing I'm going to do is look at the base of the plant and get rid of anything really spindly at the base, or that's going to be really hard to harvest. I'm going to have to get down on my knees to harvest it, make it maybe harder to mow or weed whack if that's how I'm managing the vegetation nearby. And then after I do those first two things, then I'm going to start to work my way up in the canopy and be looking for kind of dead things or things that are just some level of crowding is okay, but overly crowded, either within an individual plant or within neighboring plants where you've got canopy upon canopy. Even though I'm sort of thinking about each plant and its health and vigor, I'm also thinking about like, what does the neighborhood look like? How crowded are the neighboring plants encroaching on one another? And can I prune this or that branch to open things back up a little bit? And then finally, the last step, and did I bring any of this? Oh, here, I'll pretend. The last step is I'm going to come through, maybe remove a little bit of shorter branches like this that are kind of crowded as well. But I'm also going to spend a few minutes coming through and really trying to get rid of this. These were like previous season's laterals that bore fruit that have now died off. Didn't just put out new vegetative growth from them. Hopefully new vegetative growth came from below this point. I want to get rid of this kind of stuff, but I also, with any one plant, you could spend an hour on one plant, or you could say, okay, I got I've got 500 plants. I've only got 5 minutes per plant. You have to make a judgment call of like, how much time do you have? And how many plants are you dealing with? At home, I only got 12 plants. I can spend a lot of time and be really meticulous about each little cut. But here, we don't dedicate as much time to each plant because it's going to take too long. And so that's part of like the judgment call you'd have to make ultimately. Jessica, next slide. We talked about this a little bit in the previous. So this, yeah, just kind of transition from pure green fruit, beginnings of rosy fruit. Even in this cluster on the right, you see at least one blue fruit there, and you can keep going. One thing I wanted to just point out here that you probably have seen on blueberries that they have this kind of like gray coating on the outside. That's called the epicuticular wax. And that's actually something that the plant naturally produces to reflect away some sunlight to reduce water loss. And when you buy blueberries at a farmer's market, or if you pick your own blueberries, oftentimes they'll still really have that kind of gray cast on them. Usually, supermarket berries and such, they've been handled too much, and that just rubs right off. And they've been in the process of sorting and packing, that wax on the outside just disappears. But it's a naturally occurring substance that's part of the plant's sort of adaptive strategies. You can keep going. I'll just say that so efficiencies in hand harvesting, that's like sort of like a misnomer. I don't think there are many efficiencies in hand harvesting. Wait, what's your experience harvesting blueberries? Yeah, so slow. So in fact, we get folks to come help us pick blueberries because they're a slow process. Some varieties, there is a thing called a blueberry rake that's basically like a little basket with kind of fine teeth on it, and you comb through a whole cluster and it strips the whole cluster. But if you don't have uniform ripening, then you're stripping off a whole bunch of fruit that's not yet ripe that you're going to just discard, because the blueberries don't really ripen off the plant. Wherever you pick them is basically where they are. And they have a good shelf life, but they don't, unlike like a peach tree, or like a peach that you might harvest at a ripe but not fully soft stage and then will ripen on the counter. That doesn't happen with blueberries, really. So on a large commercial scale, this probably $120,000 unit on the left is basically how blueberries are picked. The plants are pruned to allow a machine like this to essentially drive right over the entire canopy. And you can see how the bottom is really brought up so that the machine can work through there. And then a series of little fingers basically knock and strip all the fruit off. It's funneled down into the bottom of the machine and then goes back in the back of the machine. It comes out on a conveyor belt and is getting put into big totes. And you can go to the and be it like the totes that you see kind of on the two right hand here. Unfortunately, what happens even with the most uniform and consistent varieties is you get a lot of green fruit that is essentially wasted. In this bottom, the bin on the bottom left, that's a red bin. That was one that was probably picked by hand. And so you have a lot less sort of fruit loss. There's certainly some blue and rosy fruit in there, but some loss, but much less. You can go to the next one. Large scale supermarket berries, this is part of what's going to end up happening. They're actually going to get sorted. They're going to get dumped onto a conveyor and they're going to get laser sorted. And it looks, those are pretty blue. So either they have a totally uniform variety, or this is like second round sorting. And you can go to the next slide too. As with many other fruits, there's usually some sort of processing line in a cold room where either mechanically they're being sorted and separated by lasers and or by hand, given a final run through to make sure that that you're only selling kind of truly ripe berries that'll be shipped. You can go on to the next. Here it's a super slow, picking is slow, and we literally sort everything by hand, and it takes a long time. I'd say everything that we do, pruning's pretty fast and efficient. All the fertility inputs and stuff, it takes some time, but it's pretty quick, and it's kind of a quick and dirty operation. But the harvesting and sorting process is a much slower process that just takes time. At home, I don't think that really matters, but if you're thinking about selling blueberries, building in efficiencies in how you prune, how you, the uniformity of ripening of the varieties that you harvest, and the means by which you're sorting is really important. And we take all our fruit, we dump it out in big, like sanitized plastic basins, and then we're just sorting and scooping and casting aside any unripe fruit, and taking the ripe fruit and then either packing it into half pints, or if you see in the right-hand picture, just into Ziploc bags that we're going to go make ice cream. In the case of the ice cream, we do a little less refined sort because they're all going to get processed anyway. But for fresh market, really try to have a quality sort. And I think the next one might be the end. Let's see. Yeah. I love growing blueberries. I love eating blueberries. I highly encourage you to do the same if you aren't already. They are easy as long as you really manage pH. And if you're picking for yourself, I feel like the picking process is a really beautiful and meditative process. If you're picking for sale, it's more effort. More effort, Jessica. Okay. Is garlic barrier spray an effective repellent or deterrent for birds? Yes, temporarily. And what I mean by that is, at least my experience with garlic is that it only, that essence, the smell sticks around for a while, but if you get fog, we're not going to probably get any rain, but if you get any fog, that's going to really help to just wash it off and dilute it off much more quickly. The other thing is that I don't want to spray that on my plants as I'm getting towards ripe fruit, when the birds are going to be most likely to come in for a visit and a grazing, because then I'm going to have garlic blueberries rather than blueberries. So yeah, but early on, maybe so, as like let's see if we can get it in their consciousness. This isn't a good idea to come to these plants, but when I'm getting close to ripe fruit, I wouldn't want to do that. Great question. I would love to say that I sterilize my pruners between every single plant. That's a really good practice. Do I actually do that? No. However, so that's an ideal practice, and I will say that doing so, if you're dealing with diseased plants, whether blueberries or otherwise, then that is critical. I don't want to be pruning a blueberry, a raspberry that's got rust on it, an apple tree that's got fungal spores and so forth, or something that's got, worst case scenario, fire blight. I don't want to be pruning something with fire blight, get it on my pruners, and then go to a clean tree that doesn't have fire blight. And so absolutely sterilizing tools between. But in this case, we're unlikely to see that, and so we don't usually bother to. But it's important to, just make an informed decision about to be more careful or not. Maybe one more online in there. Lots of coffee grounds, yes. Coffee grounds are a good input for sure. If you're getting it enough volume from like a roaster or a coffee shop, then you may be able to have a more significant impact. If it's just your own home coffee, that you're doing daily, you may not. It's certainly a good input. That's a great place to put it, but it may not be enough to actually have a substantial impact on soil pH. Bye. Yeah, thank you all very much for coming. Hopefully this was useful and informative. We're going to try to transition to going and looking at some plants up in the up here on the farm. But we have a couple more questions here, and yeah.